So this is Jay Dawes with Elite Sports Services, and I'm the education director for the group here. And today we're with Dr. Gene Coleman, and just going to talk about a little bit about his experiences and kind of pick his brain on some of the things he's done over the years. So, Coach, I think background-wise we started out fairly similar. Like my first love was baseball. And I was a little fat kid, and all my buddies made the team, and I wasn't quite good enough to do that. So, I kind of started developing an enthusiasm for strength conditioning and trying to learn how I could make that next jump and actually make the team. And at that point in time, back in the mid '80s, resistance training and strength conditioning wasn't necessarily advocated by a lot of coaches, especially for baseball. But just curious, over the course of your career, like what changes have you seen as far as implementing strength conditioning training with baseball players in particular?
Well, my first year in baseball, I went to spring training with the Astros minor leaguers in 1976, and they had experimented with exergeny about a decade before that, and with disastrous results.
Right.
And so the goal was that we were going to introduce strength training at the minor league level, and we were going to start at the AA team, and then see if we could progress up the ladder. And so first thing we did was we measured strength. We measured upper body strength and lower body strength in all of our minor league players. And what we found was when we compared them to strength training classes, and I was teaching a couple of strength training classes at the University of Texas at Austin, that they were weaker. So we had professional athletes that were weaker than kids who were starting a strength training class, not finishing a strength training class, but starting a strength training class. In terms of upper body and lower body strength. And this is understandable because the specificity of training, these kids were basically either signing out of high school or signing out of college and had no formal resistance training program. So we continued that for a year, and when they came back to spring training the next year, they had made significant improvements. And the goal then was that we were going to advance up to the next level. So we would take it 1 year at a time. As it turned out, I ended up that was in '76. In '77, we went back to spring training. As I said, we had recorded those movements, those improvements. And during that summer, we had moved to Houston. And I remember my wife at breakfast was picking up the paper, and she said, "Hey, do you know the Astros Major League team is 22 games out of first place?" And about noon, I got a phone call from the general manager asking me if I could come down and talk with him. So I went down and met with the general manager, the bench coach, and so forth. And they just told me, "Hey, we're going to move it up. We're going to move up the program. We're going to start at the big league level. When can you start?" And I said, "Well, when's the season going to be over?" And they said, "Well, the season will be over in October, 1st of October. I said, "Well, then we'll start about 2 weeks after that." And they said, "Oh, no, you don't understand. We need to start now. We're 22 games out of first place." And I said, "You don't need me today. You need Oral Roberts." All right? Because I guarantee you, we start a program today, and come the end of the season, we're going to be 20 games out, 22 games out, 24 games out. It's not going to work any miracles.
Yeah. Well, and then basically strength conditioning is not useful because it didn't.
Yeah. Right. And I said, plus, when it comes time to do this off-season program, they're going to say, "Oh, we already did that, and it didn't work."
Right.
And fortunately, they bought into it, and we did a needs analysis. There's no information on baseball, and I was working with a group of my students, and I were working with some people over at NASA, and we were doing astronaut selection. So basically what we did was we took all those tests that we were using for astronaut selection and brought them into the Astrodome and tested the players. But at that time, the Astros didn't have a radar gun. They weren't measuring speed with a stopwatch. So we brought in metabolic carts. We did skin folds. We took them out and underwater weighed them. And we did that from, I'd say, end of July until September. So every home game, a home series, we were evaluating something. And then our equipment came in September, and we used September to teach them, how to utilize the equipment, but not any training. And then we started our formal training in October. So at that time, there were 3 teams that were doing something. We were doing it, the Reds were doing it, and the Phillies were doing it. And that was the start of it. And when you would go on the road, none, with the exception of Cincinnati and Philadelphia, there was no place to work out. So you had to do push-ups and squats and body weight type stuff. And now you look at it, and almost every major league team now has a weight room in the visiting clubhouse for visiting teams. So yeah, it's progressed a lot.
Yeah, you say that. So, well, and that's kind of neat to hear the beginnings of it all, and because I know that even to this day, there's some still prevailing thoughts that you're going to get big bulky muscles, and that's going to hinder your throwing performance and your ability to some of the more skill related attributes. And I think with a lot of the research that you've done over time, that we've seen that that's just not true.
Yeah, no, it's not true. And what we found is minds have changed. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't remember the last time I ran into somebody in Major League Baseball, whether it be a scout or a coach or a general manager, that was skeptical of what conditioning would do. As a matter of fact, there are elaborate reporting systems now. The general managers, trainers, managers, and so forth want to know, what are their kids doing, how often are they doing it, and then they're actually checking on them. As low down as the minor league level, they're getting weekly reports, and if a kid's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, then he gets a phone call from somebody.
I gotcha. Well, and I think as you said, it's starting to become a little bit more prevalent now, where people understand the benefits of it. But I think there's still a little bit of confusion about what are the correct things to do. And a lot of times I'll talk to athletes and say, you're either built for show or go. So what are we training for here? And when you're looking at constructing the strength and conditioning programs, versus looking athletic versus being athletic, did you have to fight that battle quite a bit?
Actually, we didn't. Not to start with.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't come about until probably the steroid era of the '90s. Yeah, when guys were wanting to get bigger.
Yeah.
And as I said, there weren't many teams doing it, and so we sort of had control of what we were doing. And then as it became more popular and guys started hiring personal trainers, then it was when, if you hadn't educated them before, you really had to start at that point in time. And so today, I heard the other day from one of our minor league coaches that they were having trouble with a player. And that player, was wanting to do more of a bodybuilding program than their type of program. So you still hear about it, but it's isolated now as compared to somewhat rampant during the mid '90s and so forth, when everybody was hitting home runs and trying to look huge.
Right.
And we were very fortunate in that with the Astros, we always had players that understood what was going on, and they would take a player to the side and sort of reading the riot act and explain what was expected of them. So
Right.
they policed themselves.
Yeah, which is always better. It's nice to have more sets of eyes than just one. And plus, again, I think with the team norms, what norms is your team established as far as what's going to be acceptable behavior and things of that nature probably goes a lot further away than just it being dictated from top down. So.
Yeah, my goal was always, I tell the players, I want to get you prepared enough, you understand enough that I worked myself out of a job. You don't
Right.
need me. It's 38 years later, and we're still going. So, but some of them have learned, but the vast majority still need guidance.
Right. Now, what about as far as the conditioning aspects of it? Because I know when I was a pitcher, our coaches, big thing that we ended up getting to do the day after, and trying to lead up to the season, was going out for massive distance running. And intuitively, I think as we were on these runs, I'm out there with all my buddies and going like, "God, why are we running 5 miles a day? I don't have to do that on the mound." So, I think there's been kind of a shift as far as, looking at how we condition for that and, energy system development and things of that nature. So, approach-wise, when you're conditioning, your pitchers and, other position players, what approach do you take with that?
Well, our approach is, short intervals. And, we tell them that if you spend 80% of your time jogging, you spend 80% of your time practicing being slow. You're working the wrong muscle groups, you're working the wrong fiber types, and you're working the wrong energy system, and you're working the wrong hormonal system. So you're doing everything backwards. And some people are successful in spite of what they do.
Right.
But
Just genetically gifted.
right, given the choice, there will be players who would prefer to go out and jog long, slow distance, because that's a lot easier to do than doing intervals. But we try to focus everything on interval training and a lot of change of direction activities. So we're trying to work on the ATP PC system as opposed to the oxygen transport system. And we're trying to improve work capacity as opposed to aerobic capacity.
Right. Well, and as far as especially pitching goes, it's such a anaerobically dominated activity. I mean, what a pitch, even with the windup, is less than 5 seconds, right? So I guess looking at it from an aerobic standpoint, that recovery between pitches becomes important. But I mean, you can develop most of that with anaerobic conditioning, correct?
Absolutely, and that's what we're telling our pitchers. I think the original theory behind long, slow distance running was you're going to rid your body of lactic acid.
Right.
But there are two problems with that theory, and one is that you don't develop a lactic acid during pitching,
Right.
and second is if you did, it would have been already dissipated by the time
Right.
the day off came.
Right. Very cool. Now, as far as we were kind of talking earlier about kids and grandkids and things of that nature, and developmentally, if you had coaches and whatnot that are working with kids that are in the younger levels, high school and before that, what would you recommend to them as far as trying to get them prepared for hitting those upper levels of performance?
Well, in what I'm working with my grandkids now is number one is being able to control their own body weight. Mm-hmm. All right. So, are you strong enough to control your own body weight? And in other words, can you squat and can you do push-ups and can you do a plank and can you do a lateral plank so that we can maintain that stability so that we can produce some force. The second thing is, can you start, stop, and change directions? And are your mechanics good? Because you can't recover from a bad start. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're trying to run to first base or whether you're trying to avoid a run down or you're trying to change directions because you misjudged a fly ball. If you have a bad start, you're not going to be able to recover for it. So do you have proper mechanics? And can we teach these mechanics in a fun way? Make it game-like, and so that they're learning in spite of themselves.
Right on. Well, and I think that's things that, a lot of kids don't understand why they're doing certain things. And if you say, well, we're developing your anaerobic energy system, they don't care. And with, so I have 3 kids at home, all under the age of 12, and every single one of them has been in gymnastics for years. And a lot of it's that same reason. Is like, I want them to develop the body awareness, the good ability to, move their body in time and space and things of that nature. Then hopefully, should they choose to, be in athletics, which, Dad secretly hopes they will, that they're able to be, better skilled at whatever sport they may choose. And I think with some of the younger kids, sport, early specialization is one of those things where I think probably a decade ago we kind of got in that trap where kids thought that the way to get really, really good at a sport was specialize really early in it, which kind of intuitively would make some sense because if you want to get really good at something, you devote a lot of time and effort to it. But I think, as you said, looking at that good multilateral development now really can have a big impact as far as just overall long-term, the levels they can actually reach.
Absolutely. Agility, balance, coordination, each of those attributes, when you go to apply it, it's different when you apply it in baseball than when you apply it in football. And it's different in gymnastics, it's different in basketball. So the more exposure you can get, the more activities you can do, the better you're going to be, when and if you ever come to specialize. And I like to put a ball in it because, if you can put a ball or if you can make it game-like, kids will really, they'll buy into it. And adult kids will buy into it also.
Oh, yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really helped my grandkids with agility, change of direction, and work capacity is that they got a dog. And that dog likes to, they chase him, they try to catch him, and it's like Rocky chasing the chicken.
That's what I'm getting ready to say.
I mean,
exactly.
they are totally out of breath, and and they're doing all the right moves, and as Lauren says, sometimes from the wrong position.
Yeah.
But they're doing, they're making the right movement patterns. And they're working on their work capacity, and they're having a good time, and the dog is thoroughly enjoying it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it takes the emphasis off that sets and reps and work rest intervals and durations and all that stuff, and puts the emphasis back on fun and trying to actually accomplish tasks. And I think kids are such concrete thinkers that, again, if you go in there and try and say, hey, these are the specific attributes to work on, they're not going to get that. If you go, hey, run down there as fast as you can, shoot a basket, run down here and try and shoot another one, they can kind of get that a little bit better.
Absolutely.
So as far as, going back to some of the stuff you did, with the Astros and, currently doing with the Rangers and whatnot, so testing-wise, you said you've looked at profiling over the years and, early on how that, kind of developed. How has that changed over the years, and what are some of the key attributes you look at now as far as what do you see being some of the biggest predictors of success?
Well, I think the three predictors that I like, one of them is vertical jump, all right, because that's an index of power. And we have data that's been published, Jay Hoffman and some of the, I think, strength coaches from 5 or 6 major league teams published data on about 1,500 professional athletes from rookie ball to the major leagues. And vertical jump is a predictor of power, and that is directly correlated to power at the plate. Home runs, extra base hits, on base percentage, and so forth. And then speed in the 10 yards. 10-yard speed is highly correlated with the ability to steal bases and total number of bases and so forth.
Right, and power as well.
Power as well. And then the third is the shuttle, lateral speed and agility. So some sort of pro agility run. And that has been directly correlated with some of our indices of fielding success, and which is back to range of motion and so forth, and distance covered. And so, those kinds of things. And then, something as simple as grip strength has also been shown to be, highly correlated to power production. So, you can do a number of elaborate types of things, but in a pinch, how fast can you run? How quickly can you change directions? Do you have a firm handshake? And how high can you jump?
Right on. Well, that's the thing, I think we can get as sophisticated as you want to get. And I think that's the thing I've noticed over the years is, sports science keeps getting more and more complicated, which can be a good thing, but also, like you said, can be a detriment at the same time, because a lot of it, you get so bogged down in all the data and all the numbers and things like that, that you forget about the eyeball test and, going, hey, this doesn't look quite right. How do we go in and fix that? And I think earlier we were talking about, some of the different, tools and, ways to look at physiological monitoring and things of that nature. Just want to get kind of your thoughts on some of those techniques and methods that are being used right now.
Yeah, some of them are good, and some of them are so elaborate that you have to have additional staff members. I know that one of my friends is an NBA coach, and he said that one of the techniques that they were using indicated that the player that they thought was the laziest player on the team was moving the most in practice. And it contradicted what they saw as coaches. And so having 4 coaches with a total of over 100 years of experience, they all said this guy's lazy, and the test or the equipment said, showed that he was moving the most, and they didn't buy it.
Yeah.
So it didn't support, their opinions.
Right.
And so sometimes as a coach, the machine says one thing, but players know how to cheat.
Yeah, well, it's funny. We were doing some testing back when I was in South Texas, looking at some ice hockey players, which you can imagine how popular that is down there. But, we had heart rate monitors on them during a game situation, and we had this one kid that he was getting his heart rate up pretty darn high, like close to his theoretical max, like he's pushing 200 the whole time. And he was trying to make the argument to the coaches on paper. He's like, well, see, guys, I'm working really hard here. I'm working at a high level. I'm like, well, yeah, it's because you're getting beaten like you stole something. It's like, so that's not a good thing. We need you to work less hard and be more energy efficient and conserve that energy better. So it is one of those things that a lot of times all these numbers you can get a little bit dazzled by them, and sometimes they, unless you look at them with that common sense perspective, they don't always mean what you think they mean.
Yeah, we've done heart rate. The first time I did heart rate, I was at Texas Tech, and we took their basketball players, and we found a couple of interesting things, and one was a player sitting on the bench has a heart rate down here, and the guy playing has a heart rate here. And when they go change places, one goes in and one goes out. There's an emotional effect. His heart rate immediately went up, and this guy's immediately went down. The another thing we saw was a guy shooting a free throw. His heart rate is high. If he makes it, his heart rate immediately drops.
Yeah.
If he misses it, it immediately goes up even higher. And the coach said, "Oh, that's because we've coached him so well that he's getting in position to get the rebound." And
psychological stress, is it?
And the player said, no, it's because we're looking over at the bench, because if you miss a shot, you're looking to see who's coming in. So
right.
You get different things. And then we did, I think, 4 major league games. We did the pitching coach, the hitting coach, the third base coach, and the manager. And we did their heart rates through four games. And what we found was, when we were hitting, the hitting coach's heart rate was up and the pitching coach's heart rate was down,
nice.
And vice versa. But the manager was always high.
There you go. Yeah. So buck stops there at the end of the day, no matter
yeah,
what.
and that was supported by some of the work we did with basketball, in that we looked at the coach and the referee. And the referee running up and down the court had a lower heart rate than the coach sitting on the bench. So there's a lot of emotional involvement there. But one of the things that came out of that was the coach started working out, trying to control his heart rate a little bit more. Yeah, trying to get some sort of sympathetic control here.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, that's great. So looking at again, advice. You got a young strength and conditioning professor who's wanting to get into being a strength coach in baseball, especially at the major league level. What would you recommend for them as far as those next steps?
Well, number one, they absolutely have to be certified, because they won't take anybody without that. Number two, they have to have experience, all right? And they should get experience in baseball, whether it's working with a college team or independent team or somewhere along that line. And then third, they need to expect that they're going to have to do an internship, probably with a minor league team. And, that usually convinces most coaches that they don't want to be involved in baseball, because even at the minor leagues, it's 142 games in 160 days, and half of those are on the road, and you're hunting and picking for places to work out, and the game is over at 11 o'clock or midnight, and you're getting back to your room at 1 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts. And then if the place that you're visiting doesn't have a weight room, then you've got a bus and you're taking on around 11 o'clock to a 24-hour fitness or some private gym to work out. So it's extremely long hours and little pay. So you better be sure that this is something that not only you but your entire family wants to buy into.
Yeah, right on. Well, and I think that you hit on two things. There's one is going to be that adaptability. And we always say that there's a reason why the dinosaurs are extinct, is they couldn't adapt. So being able to do the best you can with the situation that you're given, and realizing, hey, this is ideal, but that's not what we got here. So what's the next best thing in a pinch?
Ideal doesn't even exist in the major leagues. Yeah. My very first day on the job, our manager was a former Marine, Bill Verdon, and Bill was hard-nosed, and he'd been in the game a long time. And he told me the first day, he said, "I'm going to give you one word. And if you can take this word and apply it, you'll have a long career. If you can't, you might not make the day." And that word is adjust. He said players have to adjust, pitch to pitch, at bat to at bat, game to game, week to week, season to season. He said you may have the best workout planned, and back then we were working out after the game. He said, but the game may go into extra innings and the guys are too tired. Or we may have a quick bus, and so there isn't enough time to get the workout done. Or maybe the player or players you want to work with got hurt that day, or got a nagging injury, need ice, and they can't do that. Or maybe I called a team meeting, and everybody's so hacked off at me, they don't want to go work out, Or maybe the guy had a bad day, and he'd rather go, go home. So he said, if you can't adjust, then you're not going to make it.
Yeah. Well, and then the other part of that is like you talked about the grind. I mean, probably unlike any other sport, just the duration of a season with Major League Baseball. I mean, it's got to take a toll not only physically but emotionally, psychologically. From a recovery standpoint, what are some things that you did and would encourage for athletes in that area?
Well, one of the things that we tried to do was we tried to get our guys to do some sort of stretching exercise after the game. And what we basically told them was, during the game, you start the game and your muscles are this long. And after the game, they're this long, all right? And if you go home and go to bed, they're going to be this long when you get up in the morning. But if you can get them from here to here, when you get up the next morning, they might want to hear. So you're starting from a lower, from a higher initial point. Yeah. We did that, and then towards the end, as more and more information came into existence about the importance of nutrition and recovery. We wanted to make sure that we got some fluid, and we got a mixture of carbohydrate and protein in them. while they were working out. Because typically what will happen with a professional team is if they're going to work out after the game is they'll immediately come off the field, get out of their uniform, go to the weight room, and once they leave there, then they go get ice or treatment if it's needed, and then they go eat. So it might be 45 minutes to an hour before they actually get to eat. So we were feeding them as soon as they came into the weight room. If we had a starting pitcher, we were feeding them, and they're not going to be hungry, so we were feeding them, fluid meals when they came in after, if they came in after the 5th inning or 6th inning or 7th inning, they were getting it right then while they were, icing their elbow or their shoulder or whatever. And we're trying to set the stage for a quicker recovery.
Right. Well, and what about as far as like environment and things like that goes? 'Cause I mean, playing in the Astrodome is probably be a lot different than playing in California in the middle of the summertime. So how did that influence strategies and things of that nature?
Well, it depended on where you were. For example, whenever the Texas Rangers as a team work out before the game, all right, and it's 90, 95 degrees, 70% relative humidity, and if you're going to wait till after the game, you're not going to get much out of it. You're going to be tired, dehydrated, and so forth. So whenever we went into Arlington in interleague play, we always worked out before the game. Right? Atlanta, we work out before the game. Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, sometimes before the game. St. Louis, sometimes before the game, depending upon, a July trip into St. Louis is going to be different than an April trip into St. Louis, right? And then you have things like day games after night games. Yeah. There's not actually enough time to recover. So you finish the game, and then if you're going to work out, and then you're going to have a day game, there's not really enough time to recover. So, the consensus has always been, we're not going to work out, on the night before we have a day game. So we'll give ourselves a chance to recover. And then depending on where the day game is, and how long it went, don't work out after extra inning games.
Yeah.
Don't work out for double headers.
Yeah. Better give them the time to recover.
They will get more out of the recovery than they would out of the workout. Because the thing that players don't understand is that growth occurs during recovery, not during the workout.
Right.
And so it's stress, and no recovery. Probably the best player I ever worked with and the closest friend I ever made in baseball is Nolan Ryan. Yeah. And Nolan, the hard thing we had with Nolan was convincing him that work and rest are both important and neither is beneficial without the other. In other words, if Nolan had a bad outing, he wanted to go work. Yeah. And the thing that finally convinced him was he came up to me in the Astrodome one day during batting practice, and he had injured his wrist on his non-throwing hand somehow or another, and it wasn't severe, but he told me that his wrist was sore, and that the doctor told him that if he would apply friction massage to it, it would keep it warm, and it would get well sooner. And he walks off, and about 15 minutes later he comes back, and he's got a blister about the size of a face of a watch on his hand.
Working it, huh?
And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Oh, I was rubbing on it, and a blister came up." And I said, "Well, didn't it get hot?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, why didn't you stop?" He said, "Well, thought if a little bit's good, a whole lot would be better." So the next day I put in his locker a belt sander and put Nolan Ryan friction massager. If a little bit's good, a whole lot's going to be better.
Nice.
And he got the concept,
Yeah.
And after that, he went on and pitched another 15 years.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, man, I got to talk to you about that because that's growing up, Nolan was my hero. And I think that was for me as a young kid who was interested in pitching and whatnot. I read the book by Tom House that he and Tom put together and whatnot. Just looking at work ethic, and I think that was the one thing that people talked about so much with him was his work ethic, and then just his flawless technique as far as the duration of his career. And from firsthand experience, I mean, how can you speak to that a little bit more? Well,
I'll tell you, the first time I met Nolan, I get a call from the general manager. This was in the off season prior to the 1980 season, and he says, "Hey, we've signed Nolan Ryan. And we're having a reception, and we'd like for you to come meet him." So I'm standing there talking to one of our starting pitchers, Kenny Force, and I'm trying to get, this is 1979, right? And I've been in the big leagues 2 years, and I'm trying to get our pitchers to lift one time between starts. Right. So they pitch every 5th day, so we lift the 2nd day. And the only guy that hasn't bought in is Kenny Force. Right? I mean, he's doing it, but with, a lot of duress. And so I'm standing there talking to Kenny, and Nolan walks up, and he says, "You're the strength coach?" And I said, "Yep." He said, "Well, I'm going to have a problem with your weightlifting program." And Kenny Force went ear to ear. And Nolan said, "Yep, I can only lift twice between starts."
Oh, wow.
And we became instant friends at that moment. And then it progressed to, he was lifting 5 times between starts, but he lifted 5 times between starts. Clements, was a product of Nolan. He was 5 times between starts. Andy Pettit was 5 times. It's not always 5 times, at maximal type effort,
Sure.
but they're doing something, the 4 days before they pitch, and oftentimes it's doing something before they go out to the mound, or in Clement's case, after he came out of the game, to get ready for the next start. And Nolan's philosophy was you should never get beat because the other opposition is better prepared than you are. And it doesn't mean whether they get more sleep or they ate better or whatever. He said the only thing that you could control is how you prepare. You can't control the weather, you can't control the opposition, you can't control whether they put the mound together or the umpire had a right strike zone, or sometimes you just can't even control where the ball's going. But you can control how you prepare, and you shouldn't get beat because the other guy's better prepared. And then the second thing, we sat down and we talked about, what made Nolan Ryan stand out from everybody else. And I've had a lot of people say, "Oh man, you really did a lot for Nolan." I said, "Yeah, I really did. He had only 3,500 strikeouts when I met him." So, but Nolan came down to 3 things in his mind. And number 1 was genetics, right? And nobody in his family was an athlete, so he just happened to fall in the right gene pool. Number 2 was work ethic. You shouldn't get beat because somebody's better prepared. And then number 3 was proper mechanics. You can't you can't run a mile with a rock in your shoe, and you can't throw as long as he did and as hard as he did, without good mechanics. Something's going to break down. When he came to Houston in 1980, he and I sat down, and he had thrown over 100,000 pitches, over 90 miles an hour. And now if a guy throws 100 pitches in a game, he's out of the game. Nolan, in his prime of his career with the Angels, he told me a good day for him was 160 pitches a game. A typical game was 180 pitches, and he once threw 255. Right? But the thing about it was that he was doing all this on 3 days rest, and now we can't do it on 4 days rest. Right. So he said you just simply can't, you can't repeat that. Yeah. And then, Clements learned from Nolan. Nolan learned from Koufax and Seaver. But Clements always said that every year there's some phenom that that's coming along, and he's throwing 95 or 98 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. And he said, if it doesn't do you any good to throw 95 or 98 when you're 20 if you can't do it when you're 30. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't do any good to throw it in May if you can't throw it because you're on the disabled list in July or August. And so if you want to throw 95 when you're 30 or 35, you need to start working on it when you're, before you reach 20 or 25. Yeah. You need to work out.
Yeah, well, just that sustainability factor, because like I said, I think, and if memory serves, and you can certainly correct me on this, but Nolan, he was the first guy who was throwing up into his 40s that hard and that consistent, at least to my knowledge.
Yeah, I have a friend, Frank Tanana, and he was on that staff with Nolan, and I see Frank from time to time, and Frank said that he threw 95 in 75 and 75 in 95.
Nice. Well, and that's, as far as, obviously Nolan had a great work ethic and things of that nature with, his strength conditioning program, things like that. As far as, rehabilitation, prehabilitation, what were some, key factors you think may have kind of helped contribute to his success and the success of all the other pitchers you've worked with?
Well, I think one of the successes is that Dr. Jobe came up with the idea of rotator cuff exercises, because prior to Dr. Jobe, nobody was really doing it. Right. We didn't have Tommy John surgeries, and we didn't have other kind of surgeries because when you got hurt, there was nothing, you know, that they really did. And so guys just retired and went to work. But, you know, with the salaries being what they are, you know, a guy gets hurt, you want him to, you know, to improve. And we have guys that, you know, if I see a guy says he's going to have Tommy John surgery, I tell him to have John Smoltz surgery, because, you know, Tommy John was throwing maybe 80 when he had surgery, and he came back throwing 78. And John Smoltz was throwing 92, and he came back throwing 98. So you need
okay.
Yeah. So I think that's one aspect. The other is that the better shape that you're in, you know, the less stress you're going to have on your body. And if you can work that connection between the lower body, upper body, and going through the core, that's really going to help you. Nolan and Roger Clemens, I mean, they were big believers, you know, in having a strong, stable core from which their arms and legs could work.
Makes total sense. Well, and you know, I think, you know, again, just looking at it over the years and things of that nature, you talked about, you know, limiting pitch counts and things like that. Do you think that's been a benefit or a hindrance in some ways?
No, time will tell.
Yeah.
In the old days, everybody threw a lot. I mean, you know, if you look at Seaver and Nolan and Ferguson Jenkins and Steve Carlton and Fernando Valenzuela, you know, those guys were, you know, 150, 160 pitches a game. You know, never pitched, never missed a spot in the rotation. I think one year Ferguson Jenkins had, I think, 36 starts in Wrigley Field in Chicago. So those are day games.
Yeah.
And I think he had 29 complete games or something like that. Won the Cy Young, had the lowest ERA in baseball. You know, they were prepared to do that. Nolan's a big believer that if you haven't prepared to do that when you're young, and then you get into the professional ball and you try to do it, you don't have the background. You haven't built that base from which, you know, you can work. And a lot of kids now, when you look at them, you know, they're coming through the draft, and you look at them and you're saying, you know, we've got to pitch every fifth day in the big leagues if you're a starting pitcher, maybe every day or 3 days in a row if you're in the bullpen. And these kids are coming in and they pitch, you know, maybe 6 innings every 6 days, or, you know, they don't go over 7 innings or something other like that, and you're trying to figure out, you know, how are you going to progress these guys up to, you know, throwing 120, 150 pitches in a game when they're coming out of the game, you know, at 70 pitches. I had a manager, Larry Durkert, one time said, you know, we had this pitcher named Shane Reynolds, who's probably maybe the best conditioned player I've ever had as a pitcher, and he said, why can't Shane ever get into the 8th inning? And I said, because you keep taking him out in the 7th. You know, if you want,
got to grind through it. Yeah.
If you want him to pitch in the 8th, let him go out there. You know.
Yeah. Now, what about some of the hitters, like like Glenn Davis and, you know, some of those guys? Yeah. As far as, like, you know, training conditioning programs, like, how do they differ from, you know, your pitchers?
Well, you know, power hitters. You train a power hitter different than you would train a pitcher, or different than you would train a shortstop or a second baseman or something like that, because they don't, you know, they're bangers. You know, they're not expected to cover a whole lot of ground,
right.
But they're expected to hit the ball hard. And so I would say the best conditioned position player that I ever came in contact with was Jeff Bagwell. And Baggy was built like a cement block.
Yeah.
And he was strong as an ox, and he lifted very heavy, and he lifted very often. Yeah. And you know, I can't tell you the number of New Year's Eves that I spent either in the Astrodome or Minute Maid, either a New Year's Eve because he wanted to get in the last workout, or New Year's Day because, you know, he wanted to start out right.
Yeah.
And I can remember one time we were playing on a Thursday night. I think we were Wednesday or Thursday night. We were ESPN game of the whatever it was, and we got beat by the Cubs like 14-2 or something other like that. And Sammy Sosa hit 3 or 4 home runs, and Baggy took an 0 for 4 with about 3 strikeouts. And his index of strength was he liked to bench press 3 by 335. All right, and so our goal was by the last off-season workout, he would do 3 by 335. The last day of spring training, 3 by 335. All-Star break, 3 by 335, and then sometime in late September, 3 by 335. That
Measuring stick,
yeah,
yeah,
that was his
yeah.
measuring stick of how strong he was. And so we were scheduled that night. He was late in September. He was going to do his 3 by 335, and the game went on for like 4 hours. And they opened the roof early, so it was hot and humid. And as we were leaving the dugout, I said, "Hey, Baggy, let's do this tomorrow." And he said, "No, we're going to do it tonight. We have it scheduled for tonight. We will do it tonight." He said, "Get those young kids in." So we had a couple of young kids that were September call-ups. And so I got them and I said, "Hey, look, just stand around. Don't get near where Baggy is, but just stand around and where you can see. Get someplace where you can see." And Baggy gets under the bar and he said, "I got to get this up." I said, "Why?" He said, "I have to make a good impression on the young kids."
Yeah.
And he does it and he walks out. And then I told him, I said, "Do you know how hard it is to lift 3 by 335, in December, at 11 o'clock in the morning after you've had a good night's sleep?" And, I mean, this guy's been here since noon,
Yeah.
and he's had a horrible day. The game's gone on forever. It's hot and it's humid. And all he wanted to do was make a good impression on you. And you don't have to lift 300 pounds. You don't have to bench press, but you have to do something,
Yeah. Well, and what about as far as like work ethic and just creating that culture? And it sounds like you had some players that were just rock solid as far as their ability to go in and do work and to get people to rally around them and buy into that.
Yeah, my first job, I was very fortunate. We had players that wanted the program. Bob Watson, J.R. Richard, Jose Cruz. And Jose, I am still friends with all of those guys, but they wanted the program. They were the guys that went to the general manager and said, "Hey, we need to do something." So we started with them, and that was 78, and then Nolan rolled around in 80.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had Nolan for 9 years. And after that we had Ken Caminetti, Craig Biggio, Jeff Bagwell, and then more recently, Hunter Pence.
Mm-hmm.
So we always had somebody, and these were guys that would go around to the younger guys and say, "Hey, you need to be in there. If I'm going to be in there, you're going to be in there." And so you really didn't have to do a whole lot of arm twisting,
Yeah.
And then we've been very fortunate that we always had managers that were very supportive. And we'd come to you and say, "Is so-and-so doing his job? Do I need to talk to him?" And my philosophy was, I'm not doing my job if you have to talk to him.
Right.
And I always told players, I will not, I'll not tattle on you, but if I'm asked, I won't lie for you.
Right.
So, and they appreciated that.
Yeah.
And they still, players still appreciate that. And then the other thing was, the ability to have players police themselves. I mean, if you have a problem with somebody, you just go to a team leader and they'll go talk to the guy, and the results are usually much better that way.
Right. That's great. Well, Coach, we've taken a lot of your time today. Hey, I really appreciate it. And like I said, just getting to talk to you about all this stuff is a thrill. Like I said, with my background and my love of baseball and strength and conditioning as well, getting to have you here really combines both those loves together. So I really do appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Enjoyed it.
All right, sir. Appreciate you.
Thank you.